All right, good evening, everybody. Hopefully, you're all having a good weekend so far. I'd like to thank you for joining me this evening. So, in just a moment, we'll be beginning our episode tonight. We are continuing to read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. There it is there on the screen. And tonight, specifically, we'll be reading chapters 3 and 4 of Book 3. Before we go on with that, I'd just like to, and if you've watched my other episodes of this book, you've already heard this, but I really want to repeat it because we're coming into the section of the book I think it's likely to be most applicable. And that is, C.S. Lewis is a very famous author and so forth, but he is a product of his time. And what I mean by that is that he does occasionally express certain prejudices against that we would find unacceptable today, particularly against homosexuality, as well as women's place in the world. It's a bit misogynist. Now there is a view that goes around these days that if a person is expressed or holds views that are objectionable, that it automatically negates everything else that they've done. I do not hold that view, especially when we are looking at historical figures. Quite frankly, for him to thought differently than the way he thinks on these matters would be really quite unique for the time that he lived in. So I think that he still says quite a lot of thought-provoking things that are worth reading and looking at and thinking about, but it cannot be denied that he does express some views that are questionable. And I just wanted to reiterate this because of the fact that we are in the section of the book, the book 3 is called Christian Behavior, so we are definitely in the section where I believe these comments come up. When they come up, I also don't believe in censorship, so I will read them, and if they do come up, we will discuss them afterwards. I'm not going to gloss over the views he held. I'm not trying to deny anything. I'm just saying, we have to understand he is living in a different time period, and thus holds some different views on things. So, before we begin, as you may remember, we begin each episode with a poem. Tonight's poem is The Road Not Taken by the famous American poet Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So that was The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, one of his more famous poems. Okay, so let's dive right in now to this week's reading. Again, we are in Book 3 of Mere Christianity. The name of the overall book is Christian Behavior. We are starting with Chapter 3, which is Social Morality. The first thing to get clear about Christian morality between man and man is that in this department, Christ did not come to preach any brand new morality. The golden rule of the New Testament do as you would be done by, is a summing up of what everyone at bottom had always known to be right. Really great moral teachers never do introduce new moralities. It is quacks and cranks who do that. As Dr. Johnson said, people need to be reminded more often than they need to be instructed. The real job of every moral teacher is to keep on bringing us back, time after time, to the old, simple principles which we are all so anxious not to see. Like bringing a horse back and back to the fence it has refused to jump, or bringing a child back and back to the bit in its lesson that it wants to shirk. The second thing to get clear is that Christianity has not and does not profess to have a detailed political program for applying do as you would be done by to a particular society at a particular moment. It could not have. It is meant for all men at all times, and the particular program which suited one place or time would not suit another. And anyhow, that is not how Christianity works. When it tells you to feed the hungry, it does not give you lessons in cookery. When it tells you to read the scriptures, it does not give you lessons in Hebrew and Greek or even in English grammar. It was never intended to replace or supersede the ordinary human arts and sciences. It is rather a director which will set them all to their right jobs, and a source of energy which will give them all new life, if only they will put themselves at its disposal. People say, the church ought to give us a lead. That is true if they mean it in the right way, but false if they mean it in the wrong way. By the church, they ought to mean the whole body of practicing Christians. And when they say that the church should give us a lead, they ought to mean that some Christians, those who happen to have the right talents, should be economists and statesmen, and that all economists and statesmen should be Christians, and that their whole efforts in politics and economics should be directed to putting do as you would be done by into action. If that happened, and if we others were really ready to take it, then we should find the Christian solution for our own social problems pretty quickly. But of course, when they ask for a lead from the church, most people mean that they want the clergy to put out a political program. That is silly. The clergy are those particular people within the whole church who have been specially trained and set aside to look after what concerns us as creatures who are going to live forever. And we are asking them to do a quite different job for which they have not been trained. The job is really on us, on the layman. The application of Christian principles, say, to trade unionism or education, must come from Christian trade unionists and Christian schoolmasters. Just as Christian literature comes from Christian novelists and dramatists, not from the bench of bishops getting together and trying to write plays and novels in their spare time. All the same, the New Testament, without going into details, gives us a pretty clear hint of what a fully Christian society would be like. Perhaps it gives us more than we can take. It tells us that there are to be no passengers or parasites. If man does not work, he ought not to eat. Everyone is to work with his own hands, and what is more, everyone's work is to produce something good. There will be no manufacture of silly luxuries, and then of sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. There is to be no swank or side, no putting on airs. To that extent, a Christian society would be what we now call leftist. On the other hand, it is always insisting on obedience. Obedience and outward marks of respect from all of us to properly appointed magistrates, from children to parents, and, I'm afraid this is going to be very unpopular, from wives to husbands. Thirdly, it is to be a cheerful society, full of singing and rejoicing and regarding worry or anxiety as wrong. Courtesy is one of the Christian virtues, and the New Testament hates what it calls busybodies. If there were such a society in existence and you or I visited it, I think we should come away with a curious impression. We should feel that its economic life was very socialistic and in that sense advanced, but that its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. Each of us would like some bits of it, but I'm afraid very few of us would like the whole thing. That is just what one would expect if Christianity is the total plan for the human machine. We have all departed from that total plan in different ways, and each of us wants to make out that his own modification of the original plan is the plan itself. You will find this again and again about anything that is really Christian. Everyone is attracted by bits of it and wants to pick out those bits and leave the rest. That is why we do not get much further, and that is why people who are fighting for quite opposite things can both say that they are fighting for Christianity. Now another point. There is one bit of advice given to us by the ancient heathen Greeks, and by the Jews in the Old Testament, and by the great Christian teachers of the Middle Ages, which the modern economic system has completely disobeyed. All these people told us not to lend money at interest, and lending money at interest, what we call investment, is the basis of our whole system. Now, it may not absolutely follow that we are wrong. Some people say that when Moses and Aristotle and the Christians agreed in forbidding interest, or usury as they called it, they could not foresee the joint stock company, and were only thinking of the private moneylender, and that therefore we need not bother about what they said. This is a question I cannot decide on. I am not an economist, and I simply do not know whether the investment system is responsible for the state we are in or not. This is where we want the Christian economist. But I should not have been honest if I had not told you that 3 great civilizations had agreed, or so it seems at first sight, in condemning the very thing on which we have based our whole life. One more point, and I am done. In the passage where the New Testament says that everyone must work, it gives as a reason, in order that he may have something to give to those in need. Charity, giving to the poor, is an essential part of Christian morality. In the frightening parable of the sheep and the goats, it seems to be the point on which everything turns. Some people nowadays say that charity ought to be unnecessary, and that instead of giving to the poor, we ought to be producing a society in which there were no poor to give to. They may be quite right in saying that we ought to produce this kind of society. But if anyone thinks that as a consequence you can stop giving in the meantime, then he has parted company with all Christian morality. I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I am afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc. is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charities' expenditure excludes them. I am speaking now of charities in the common way. Particular cases of distress among your own relatives, friends, neighbors, or employees, which God, as it were, forces upon your notice, may demand much more, even to the crippling and endangering of your own position. For many of us, the great obstacle to charity lies not in our luxurious living or desire for more money, but in our fear of insecurity. This must often be recognized as a temptation. Sometimes our pride also hinders our charity. We are tempted to spend more than we ought on the showy forms of generosity, tipping, hospitality, and less than we ought on those who really need our help. And now, before I end, I am going to venture on a guess as to how this section has affected any who have read it. My guess is that there are some leftist people among them who are very angry that it has not gone further in that direction, and some people of an opposite sort who are angry because they think it has gone much too far. If so, that brings us right up against the real snag in all this drawing up of blueprints for a Christian society. Most of us are not really approaching the subject in order to find out what Christianity says. We are approaching it in the hope of finding support from Christianity for the views of our own party. We are looking for an ally where we are offered either a master or a judge. I am just the same. There are bits in this section that I wanted to leave out, and that is why nothing whatever is going to come of such talks unless we go much longer way around. A Christian society is not going to arrive until most of us really want it, and we are not going to want it until we become fully Christian. I may repeat, do as you would be done by, till I am black in the face, but I cannot really carry it out till I love my neighbor as myself, and I cannot learn to love my neighbor as myself till I learn to love God, and I cannot learn to love God except by learning to obey him. And so, as I warned you, we are driven on to something more inward, driven on from social matters to religious matters, for the longest way round is the shortest way home. Sorry for a little bit of yawning there. Chapter 4 of Book 3 is called Morality and Psychoanalysis. I have said that we should never get a Christian society unless most of us became Christian individuals. That does not mean, of course, that we can put off doing anything about society until some imaginary date in the far future. It means that we must begin both jobs at once. The job of seeing how do as you would be done by can be applied in detail to modern society, and the job of becoming the sort of people who really would apply it if we saw how. I now want to begin considering what the Christian idea of a good man is, the Christian specification for the human machine. Before I come down to details, there are two more general points I should like to make. First of all, since Christian morality claims to be a technique for putting the human machine right, I think you would like to know how it is related to another technique which seems to make similar claim, namely psychoanalysis. Now you want to distinguish very clearly between two things, between the actual medical theories and technique of the psychoanalysts, and the general philosophical view of the world which Freud and some others have gone on to add to this. The second thing, the philosophy of Freud, is in direct contradiction to the other great psychologist, Jung. And furthermore, when Freud is talking about how to cure neurotics, he is speaking as a specialist on his own subject. But when he goes on to talk general philosophy, he is speaking as an amateur. It is therefore quite sensible to attend to him with respect in the one case and not in the other. And that is what I do. I am all the readier to do it because I have found that when he is talking off his own subject, and on a subject I do not know something about, namely language, he is very ignorant. On a subject I do know something about, namely language, he is very ignorant. But psychoanalysis itself, apart from all the philosophical additions that Freud and others have made to it, is not in the least contradictory to Christianity. Its technique overlaps with Christian morality at some points, and it would not be a bad thing if every person knew something about it. But it does not run the same course all the way, for the two techniques are doing rather different things. When a man makes a moral choice, two things are involved. One is the act of choosing. The other is the various feelings, impulses, and so on, which his psychological outfit presents him with, and which are the raw material of his choice. Now, this raw material may be of two kinds. Either it may be what we would call normal, it may consist of the sort of feelings that are common to all men, or else it may consist of quite unnatural feelings due to things that have gone wrong in his subconscious. Thus, fear of things that are really dangerous would be an example of the first kind. An irrational fear of cats or spiders would be an example of the second kind. The desire of a man for a woman would be of the first kind. The perverted desire of a man for a man would be of the second. Now, what psychoanalysis undertakes to do is to remove the abnormal feelings, that is to give the man better raw material for his acts of choice. Morality is concerned with the acts of choice themselves. Put it this way. Imagine 3 men who go to a war. One has the ordinary, natural fear of danger that any man has, and he subdues it by moral effort and becomes a brave man. Let us suppose that the other 2 have, as a result of things in their subconscious, exaggerated irrational fears which no amount of moral effort can do anything about. Now suppose that a psychoanalyst comes along and cures these 2, that is, he puts them both back in the position of the first man. Well, it is just then that the psychoanalytical problem is over and the moral problem begins. Because now that they are cured, these 2 men might take quite different lines. The first might say, "Thank goodness I've got rid of all those doodahs. Now at last I can go do what I always wanted to do, my duty to my country." But the other might say, "Well, I'm very glad that I now feel moderately cool under fire, but of course that doesn't alter the fact that I'm still jolly well determined to look after number 1 and let the other chap do the dangerous job whenever I can." Indeed, one of the good things about feeling less frightened is that I can now look after myself much more efficiently and be much cleverer at hiding the fact from the others. Now this difference is a purely moral one, and psychoanalysis cannot do anything about it. However much you improve the man's raw material, you've still got something else, the real free choice of the man on the material presented to him, either to put his own advantage first or to put it last. And this free choice is the only thing that morality is concerned with. The bad psychological material is not sin, but a disease. It does not need to be repented of, but to be cured. And by that way, that is very important. Human beings judge one another by their external actions. God judges them by their moral choices. When a neurotic who has a pathological horror of cats forces himself to pick up a cat for some good reason, it is quite possible that in God's eyes he has shown more courage than a healthy man may have shown in winning the Victoria Cross. When a man who has been perverted from his youth and taught that cruelty is the right thing does some tiny little kindness or refrains from some cruelty he might have committed, and thereby perhaps risks being sneered at by his companions, he may, in God's eyes, be doing more than you and I would do if we gave up life itself for a friend. It is as well to put this the other way around. Some of us who seem quite nice people may in fact have made so little use of a good heredity and a good upbringing that we are really worse than whom we regard as fiends. Can we be quite certain how we should have behaved if we had been saddled with the psychological outfit, and then with the bad upbringing, and then with the power, say, of Himmler? That is why Christians are told not to judge. We see only the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material, but God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. Most of the man's psychological makeup is probably due to his body. When his body dies, all that will fall off him, and the real central man, the thing that chose, that made the best or the worst of this material, will stand naked. All sorts of nice things which we thought our own, but which were really due to a good digestion, will fall off some of us. All sorts of nasty things which were due to complexes or bad health will fall off others. We shall then for the first time see everyone as he really was. There will be surprises. And that leads on to my second point. People often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you, and if you don't, I'll do the other thing. I do not think that is the best way of looking at it. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, and the part of you that chooses into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven. That is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. Each of us at each moment is progressing to the one state or the other. That explains what always used to puzzle me about Christian writers. They seem to be so very strict at one moment and so very free and easy at another. They talk about mere sins as of thought, as if they were immensely important, and then they talk about the most frightful murders and treacheries as if you had only got to repent and all would be forgiven. But I've come to see that they are right. What they are always thinking of is the mark which the action leaves on that tiny central self which no one sees in this life, but which each one of us will have to endure or enjoy forever. One man may be so placed that his anger sheds the blood of thousands, and another so placed that however angry he gets, he will only be laughed at. But the little mark on the soul may be much the same in both. Each has done something to himself which, unless he repents, will make it harder for him to keep out of the rage next time he is tempted, and will make the rage worse when he does fall into it. Each of them, if he seriously turns to God, can have that twist in the central man straightened out. Each is in the long run doomed if he will not. The bigness or smallness of the thing, seen from the outside, is not what really matters. One last point. Remember that, as I said, the right direction leads not only to peace but to knowledge. When a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly the evil that is still left in him. When a man is getting worse, he understands his own badness less and less. A moderately bad man knows that he is not very good. A thoroughly bad man thinks he's all right. This is common sense, really. You understand sleep when you are awake, not while you're sleeping. You can see mistakes in arithmetic when your mind is working properly. While you're making them, you cannot see them. You can understand the nature of drunkenness when you are sober, not when you are drunk. Good people know about both good and evil. Bad people do not know about either. So that's the end of our reading today. So I have a couple thoughts myself, but I'm going to take a pause here, see if anyone wants to comment. We did definitely encounter a couple of the things I warned about. The most obvious line here, the desire of a man for a woman would be of the first kind, the perverted desire of a man for a man would be the second. Right. So, that is not generally considered to be the view of the Episcopal Church and many other Anglican churches in other parts of the world. It doesn't quite work that way. I would like to point out that at least he's slightly more advanced than some other people in the same time period where, he sees it as some kind of disease to be cured, which, while that is wrong, is at least better than just believing that people who are homosexual are just horribly perverted and corrupted and beyond saving, and that they're making, wicked choices and giving into temptation and all that sort of thing. It seems to me at least slightly more advanced that he thinks of it as some sort of psychological disease. I would like to point out that at the time period, I believe that was even the general accepted view of psychology itself. I think that psychology used to list homosexuality as a psychological disease. Now that, of course, is not considered acceptable today. We know better. We don't really believe that anymore. Psychology doesn't list homosexuality, and there's general consensus across most places that you can't pray away or cure away the gay or whatever ridiculous things that people used to believe. So it's, it's just not the way we generally think anymore. I would like to point out that it is a product of his time. So he, I don't agree with him, but I'm not going to condemn him because, again, it was the view of his time. And I would point out that, and I could be wrong about this, but he does seem to have at least a slightly more advanced view of it than many people of his time. I do agree that psychoanalysis and Christianity are not in contradiction. I do find this entire chapter to be slightly humorous, though, in that he, talks about how Freud, when Freud talks about things other than psychoanalysis itself, that he is talking off his own subject and comes off as quite ignorant, and so we shouldn't look to Freud for a general philosophical view, but just for things in his expertise of psychoanalysis, considering that this whole chapter is essentially a comment by someone who is who himself admits is not a psychoanalyst. It is an interesting chapter. In the first chapter, he talks about, I agree with some of what he says, but not all. I think perhaps the view of things is a little different, today than then. Number one, I do agree with him that Christianity is not a political program. It is not, a specific thing. The church is not here to run the country. It's a very difficult thing to talk about. One of the things he talks about is, he talks about, wives obeying husbands and stuff like that. I think what he himself is forgetting is that, yes, the Bible comes to us from God, but the Bible is ultimately written, recorded, and copied by men who have prejudices, men who have their own views, and that by some amount are probably going to kind of sneak in there. You can take that part of the Bible where it says, wives, obey your husbands, as strict and literal a commandment. It also says, slaves, obey your master. But most of us would agree that it is not an endorsement of slavery. There are some who may think that that's what it meant, but that is not what its purpose was. Its point is that you should, at least as I understand it, and so I'm not at this moment claiming to be a great moral authority on the subject, but that you should obey those to whom you owe obedience. Now, children owe obedience to their parents. There are always exceptions to that rule. If their parents are mistreating them and things of that nature, that does, things change. In the time period, it was generally seen women were treated more like property. We do not hold that view today. We have a far more advanced view that could be merely the product of society as a whole, essentially moving away from a society where where the majority of work is physical, and to a society in which the majority of work is mental. So the few things at which men may hold some sort of biological advantage, being normally speaking, size and strength. That is not to say that I'm claiming to be stronger or more capable than anybody myself, but I'm just saying that, the change in society over the centuries has left us in a different situation. And, I agree where he says that Christianity is, here he says, it is meant for all men at all times, and the particular program which suited one place or time would not suit another. And I completely and totally agree with that. I almost look at it as society is advancing. We are getting closer and more able, we are closer now, in my opinion, to the ability to live in a more Christian society in terms of the way it was meant, in a way Christ wanted us to, a society that's less violent, that's a society that's, less prejudiced. That's my opinion. I think that, society advances. And, I would argue that Christianity is, in a lot of cases, at the forefront of those changes. Many of the people of every race that took part in the civil rights movement were motivated in what they were doing by their Christian beliefs. Many of those who were abolitionists fighting against slavery were, again, motivated by their religious beliefs. And in those specific cases that we're talking about, for the most part, their Christian beliefs. So I would argue that his problem is he kind of says one thing and then kind of says something that's a little off from it. He does talk about how in some ways the society aligning to Christian morality would be far more to the left, and in other ways it would be more to the right. And I understand that. I agree he's probably correct. The point is that, if you are watching from here in the United States, Jesus is not a Democrat, and Jesus is not a Republican. If you're watching up in Canada, Jesus is not a New Democrat or a Liberal or a Conservative. If you're watching from the UK, Jesus is not a Labour Party. He is not a Conservative Party. He is not Liberal Democrat. He is not Scottish Nationalist or Plaid Cymru. He's none of those things. So I would, say that we all have to work to better our society. But we should, upon occasion, stop and take stock and think about what we are doing and what we're supporting, and think about whether it really does line up with our religious beliefs. That's my opinion, of course, and I'm sure there are people out there who completely disagree with me on this. So those are my basic thoughts today. We did hear a couple of those other things that I stated that we would hear while reading this book. Again, I didn't want to gloss over them, but I did want to discuss them. We are probably going to hear more. It would not surprise me, considering that the next chapter that we'll be reading on Wednesday is sexual morality followed by Christian marriage. So we're probably going to be getting more into this very subject. But like I said, whether I agree with C.S. Lewis on everything or not, it's kind of hard to describe C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is kind of a theological or a Christian philosopher, if you will, an amateur theologian, and he gives us a lot of good thoughts about things that help us to think about what we believe and about how we got there. We may not always agree with him on everything, but that's it's good to talk about these things and to think about them. So I hope you got something out of tonight. Again, our next episode will be on Wednesday, which I believe is the 14th. Yes, it is the 14th. Wednesday the 14th. We are still in Book 3 of Mere Christianity. We will be reading chapters 5 and 6 of Book 3 at that point. I hope some of you will join me, and it'd be great if some of you would comment in the chat, because it would be great if I could get a little back and forth going. We used to do that when I started these episodes, and then I haven't really had anyone recently want to comment. Other than that, if you are new to Christianity in general and would like more information on it or on the Episcopal or Anglican world, if you are watching on YouTube, you can find in my video description links to the beliefs page of the Episcopal Church of the United States. If you are within that world and are looking for an Episcopal church near you, there's also a link to the Episcopal Asset Map, which has all the Episcopal churches in the country. So I encourage you to look at that. I'd like to thank St. Andrew's Episcopal Church here in San Antonio, Texas, for letting me broadcast from the church here. And if you are interested in Episcopalianism at all, you might find it interesting to watch one of our services. I would point out that at this moment it is pretty easy to catch us. We have two main church services on Sunday. So tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time, there is a Rite One, which is a more traditional language church service. So that's where you get kind of King James language, like thee and thou and thy and all that. And the more contemporary language service is of Rite 2 is at 11 a.m. I'm going to, if you'll give me 1 minute, I'm going to drop a link into the chat to our church website. So if you are out there and are interested, please take a look at that. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Come on. You can, like I said, look at that tomorrow at 8:30 and 11 Central Daylight Time. And then if you enjoy it, by all means, look us up. If you're in San Antonio, if you're elsewhere, like I said, on YouTube you can find the Episcopal Asset Map, which will direct you to an Episcopal church near you. Other than that, I'd like to thank anyone who's watching and anyone who watches this later on. All of you have a great evening and blessed weekend. Thank you.